right, ready for a deep dive today? We're jumping into the world of GCP,
GCP.
good clinical practice, and we'll be focusing on how it all works in UK clinical trials.
Sounds complex.
It can be. Luckily, we've got these excerpts from GCP Human Clinical Trials UK.pdf to guide us. This document is full of insightful stuff.
So we're talking about the rules governing those big medical trials we always hear about.
Exactly. GCP is like the backbone of ethical and reliable clinical trials here in the UK. It's about making sure those medical breakthroughs are legit and built on solid ground.
Makes sense. Safety and ethics should be a top priority.
Absolutely. And that's what's so crucial about GCP. It's more than just a checklist.
Oh, definitely. You're talking about respecting people's dignity and rights, which is essential for any research involving humans.
Exactly. And that's where the Declaration of Helsinki comes in, right? That landmark document that sets the ethical standards for medical research.
Right. GCP in the UK borrows a lot from those principles. Every UK trial needs approval from an independent ethics committee before it even starts. They review every single detail to make sure it meets the highest ethical standards.
They're like the ethical watchdogs then.
Exactly. They look at everything from how participants are chosen to making sure your privacy is protected. A key thing is that joining a trial is always voluntary. You should never feel pressured.
That's so important. It's all about giving people the power to make their own health choices.
Absolutely.
But GCP isn't just about protecting participants, it's also about the data.
Oh, absolutely. That data needs to be rock solid. And that's where the ICH guidelines come into play. Think of them as the global rulebook for these trials, covering everything from designing the trial to analyzing the data.
So no cutting corners when it comes to developing new treatments.
Nope. Unreliable data helps no one. We need to make sure the information we base new therapies on is absolutely trustworthy.
Which is why GCP is so crucial. It keeps the whole process in check.
Exactly. It makes sure everything is both ethical and scientifically sound. And then, of course, you have the UK's own regulatory landscape on top of that, which has gotten even more interesting after Brexit.
Right, because even though they left the EU, they still need to maintain those international connections.
Exactly. The UK still follows those core GCP principles, but they now have their own agency calling the shots.
And that's
The MHRA, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. They're the referees for clinical trials in most of the UK, England, Scotland, and Wales. They decide if a trial can go ahead, they make sure it meets UK regulations, and they oversee the whole thing.
But you mentioned a balancing act earlier. What did you mean by that?
Yes. So here's where it gets a little complicated. The MHRA covers most of the UK, but Northern Ireland actually still follows EU rules for clinical trials.
Wait, seriously, two systems within the same country?
It's a unique situation. It means dealing with UK law, international standards, and then these specific requirements for Northern Ireland. Bit of a juggling act for sure.
I bet researchers really need to be on top of things.
Absolutely. But it shows you how committed the UK is to working with the EU, even as they're doing their own thing.
It's all about finding that balance, I guess.
Exactly. But at the end of the day, the focus remains the same: protecting those who participate in trials and upholding the integrity of the research.
Speaking of protecting participants, what about this informed consent thing? How does GCP make sure people truly understand what they're signing up for?
It's more than just signing on the dotted line, that's for sure. It's about having an open conversation throughout the trial, where the participant is empowered to make informed decisions every step of the way.
So it's an ongoing dialogue.
Precisely. You get clear explanations about what's involved, the potential risks and benefits, any other treatment options, and importantly, that you can leave the trial at any time without any pressure.
That last part is huge, knowing you can opt out without any repercussions.
Absolutely. GCP is very clear. No one should ever feel coerced into staying in a trial if they change their mind.
It's about respecting individual choice.
Exactly. And that respect goes beyond just participating. GCP also says people need to know how their data will be used and that their privacy is protected throughout the entire process.
It's about transparency and making sure participants feel like active partners in all this, not just subjects.
Exactly. Their participation is invaluable. And GCP tries to make sure participants feel respected and empowered.
Which brings us to monitoring and quality assurance. How do we make sure that once a trial is underway, it's sticking to those high ethical and scientific standards?
Well, that's where monitoring comes in. It's like having a watchful eye over the entire process and making sure everything's being done by the book.
Like a quality control team.
Exactly. They're checking procedures, making sure the data is recorded properly, you name it. Everything has to be up to par.
Sounds thorough. So what about quality assurance? Is that different?
It is. It's a bit broader. Think of it as laying the groundwork for success from the start. So before the trial even begins, they're making sure the systems and processes can meet GCP standards.
So preventing mistakes rather than just catching them?
Exactly.
Hmm.
Are we using reliable systems? Is everyone trained properly? Do our procedures align with best practices? It's all about continuously improving and striving for excellence.
I like it. A proactive approach.
Exactly. And a big part of that is conducting audits. They bring in independent experts to poke around and see if there's room for improvement.
Like a health check for the trial itself.
Precisely. And it's crucial for maintaining the integrity of the research.
And of course, clinical trials aren't a one-person show.
Oh, definitely not. It takes a whole team to bring these complex projects to life. Everyone plays a role.
So who are the key players in this orchestra?
Well, you've got the sponsor, often a pharmaceutical company, who is really driving the research. They're the ones funding it, developing the protocol, and overseeing the trial.
And then you have the investigator, right? The one interacting directly with the participants.
That's right. They're usually a doctor or researcher who is responsible for things like recruiting participants, administering the treatment, and collecting the data.
And we can't forget the ethics committees and monitors we talked about earlier. They're crucial for making sure everything is both ethical and scientifically sound.
Absolutely. And sometimes you also have contract research organizations, or CROs, involved as well.
CROs, what are those?
So CROs are companies that provide support to those running the clinical trials, like pharmaceutical companies or research institutions.
So they're like the behind-the-scenes crew.
Exactly. They might handle data management, regulatory submissions, or even help with recruiting participants. It just depends on the trial.
Wow, so many people involved. It's incredible to think about all the effort that goes into getting a new treatment from the lab to patients.
It's a team effort, for sure, and it takes a lot of expertise from different areas.
And even with the best planning, things don't always go perfectly right.
That's true. That's why GCP has guidelines for handling adverse events.
Adverse events being.
Basically, anything unfavorable that happens to a participant during a trial. It doesn't even have to be directly related to the treatment itself.
So it could be a headache or something much more serious.
Exactly. GCP stresses how important it is to quickly identify, document, and report these events.
Transparency is key.
You got it. And sometimes they even bring in an independent group called a Data Safety Monitoring Board, or DSMB, to review the safety data.
An extra layer of protection.
Precisely. They give an unbiased view of the risks and benefits, and can even recommend changing or stopping the trial if safety becomes a concern.
Wow, they have a lot of responsibility. It's impressive how much effort goes into keeping participants safe.
Definitely. It all comes down to the ethical foundations of GCP. The participants are the heart of all this, and their well-being is paramount.
Absolutely. Speaking of participants, let's switch gears a bit and talk about data management. With all the information flying around during these trials, how does GCP make sure it's all handled responsibly?
It all boils down to meticulous record keeping and making sure the data is accurate.
So we're talking about those detailed records that track every step of the trial.
Exactly. Things like case report forms or CRFs, which have in-depth info on each participant's medical history, treatment, and any adverse events. And then there's the Trial Master File, or TMF, which is like the main hub for all the essential trial documents.
Sounds like a lot of paperwork.
It can be, but thankfully more and more trials are using electronic data capture systems now, or EDC systems.
EDC systems. Tell me more.
They're essentially digital platforms that streamline data collection, management, and analysis.
So like a digital assistant for managing all this complex trial data.
Exactly. They help reduce errors, enable real-time data monitoring. They've been a game changer for clinical research.
It's incredible how technology is changing things.
It really is. And I can only imagine what the future holds for data management in this field.
Speaking of the future, let's talk about what comes after all the hard work of conducting the trial and collecting data, the audits and inspections.
Yes. The final exams. It's all about making sure that everything's been done by the book.
So who conducts these reviews and what are they looking for?
Well, you've actually got two types of reviews: audits and inspections. Audits are like internal checks, usually done by the sponsor or someone they choose.
So it's like the sponsor checking their own homework, making sure everything is in order.
Exactly. They're checking to make sure everyone followed the protocol, that the data is being managed correctly, that kind of thing, like internal quality control.
Makes sense. So then inspections are external.
Right. Inspections are the official ones, usually done by the regulatory bodies like the MHRA here in the UK.
So the MHRA is there to make sure everything meets their standards. Is it different from what the audits are looking at?
It's all part of the same goal, making sure that the trial meets those high standards of UK regulations. They look at everything, the paperwork, the data, how the trial was run. They might even interview staff.
Sounds intense. What happens if they find something wrong during an audit or inspection?
That's where corrective actions come in. It's not about punishing anyone, it's about improvement. So let's say they find a problem with how data is recorded. They would point it out, and the people running the trial would need to fix it and stop it from happening again.
So it's like getting feedback and then making revisions.
Exactly. It's all about learning from any mistakes and making the process better. The goal is to always maintain the highest possible standard for the research and, most importantly, for the safety of the people participating.
Which brings us to Brexit. How has that impacted all of this, especially here in the UK?
It's been a big change. Remember how we talked about the MHRA? Well, since Brexit, they're now completely separate from the European Medicines Agency, the EMA.
So the UK is doing its own thing now, at least when it comes to these trials.
In a lot of ways, yes. They have their own processes for approving trials, reporting safety information. They even have their own rules for handling the drugs or therapies being studied.
But we can't forget Northern Ireland. They're like their own separate world when it comes to these regulations.
It definitely adds a layer of complexity because Northern Ireland still follows the EU rules for clinical trials.
So if a trial covers both Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, it's double the regulations.
Exactly. It takes a lot of planning and coordination, but it shows that the UK is still committed to supporting research across all regions, even as they make their own way.
It seems like the UK is trying to streamline things, at least for England, Scotland, and Wales.
Absolutely. They're working on making approvals faster, which is great for getting new treatments to patients more quickly. But of course, that never comes at the expense of participant safety or data integrity. Those are always the top priorities.
Right, speed is important, but not if it means cutting corners.
Exactly. And even with all these post-Brexit changes, the UK is still really committed to upholding those international standards for GCP. They work closely with other regulatory bodies around the world.
It's like they're finding their independence while still cooperating with others.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, clinical research is about improving global health. And that requires everyone working together.
It really does. And with all this talk about regulations and guidelines, it's easy to forget about the participants themselves, the volunteers who make all this research possible.
That's such a good point. GCP isn't just about rules on paper. It's about protecting the rights, safety, and well-being of every single person participating in these trials.
Their contributions are so important. They're literally helping to shape the future of healthcare.
I couldn't agree more. They make so many life-saving treatments possible. To anyone who has ever participated in a clinical trial or is even thinking about it, thank you. It's an incredible gift.
Hear, hear. Okay, we've covered a lot. From those core principles of GCP to the unique situation with UK clinical trials after Brexit.
We talked about ethics, informed consent, the people who make it all happen, the importance of managing data and making sure everything is done right.
Phew, it's been quite the deep dive. Hopefully our listeners now understand just how much work goes into developing new treatments and therapies.
It's been great exploring this with you. But before we finish up, we wanted to leave you with something to think about.
Always love a good thought-provoking question. What do you have for us?
Well, we've talked about how clinical trials are constantly evolving. New technologies pop up, new challenges present themselves, and patient-centered approaches are more important than ever.
It's a field that never stands still.
Exactly. So here's our question. Knowing what you know now about GCP, how do you think it will need to adapt to keep up with all these changes?
That's a great question. It's not enough to just understand the rules as they are now. We need to think about how they might need to change in the future.
It really makes you think. All these new discoveries, personalized medicine, AI, even gene editing, GCP will need to make sure those are handled responsibly too.
Exactly. It's more than just the tech itself, it's the ethics of it all. How do you even get informed consent for these complex treatments? What about protecting people's privacy when you're dealing with something like genetic data? GCP has some big questions to answer.
Absolutely, it's a whole new ballgame. But that's what makes it all so interesting, right? Finding that balance between pushing boundaries and making sure we do it responsibly.
Definitely. It's a delicate balance, but an important one. Because at the end of the day, it's about making sure scientific progress benefits everyone.
Couldn't agree more. And that's why it's so important for everyone to be involved. Researchers, regulators, even the public. We all have a part to play in shaping the future of clinical research.
I like that. It's not just about leaving it to the experts, is it? We're all stakeholders in this because it ultimately affects us all.
Exactly. Clinical trials have the power to improve, even save, countless lives. We have to get this right.
We really do. On that note, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. We've explored GCP from all angles, looked at its role in UK clinical trials, and even considered what the future holds.
It's been a pleasure joining you on this deep dive.
The pleasure was all mine. To all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us. We hope this has given you a better understanding of the crucial role GCP plays in making sure those medical breakthroughs are happening safely and ethically.
And remember, the quest for knowledge never ends. Keep those questions coming, stay curious, and keep exploring the amazing world of science and medicine.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This has been The Deep Dive, signing off.